favorite podcast platforms. You could find us on YouTube. What we try to do on this show from time to time is to interview guests who can help us explore the subject of nutrition in unusual depth and advance our understanding of how to become or stay healthy. If you want to encourage that, please subscribe to this channel. And with today's guest, we're going to explore a subject that may sound like it's the very opposite of nutrition, the subject of fasting. But there's a powerful case to be made that fasting can help us achieve the same end that good nutrition helps us achieve, to make us healthy. That fasting can, in fact, aid and facilitate good nutrition. My guest, Dr. Alan Goldhamer, is founder and director for the last 40 years of the TrueNorth Health Center in Santa Rosa, California. He is co-author of the classic book, The Pleasure Trap, with Dr. Doug Lisle, and he's author of a new book called Can Fasting Save Your Life? Dr. Goldhamer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I think you'll be pleased with me. I hope so. I want you to know that I have not eaten all day. In your honor, I have been fasting. It's been only 20 hours, so it does not have to be supervised yet, but it's been a water-only fast. I feel light. I feel energized. I feel spiritually attuned, and I feel a little bit hungry. You know, when I write books, sometimes I'm asked how long it took me to write the book. And I read an advanced copy, an electronic version of Can Fasting Save Your Life? And I feel like I know the answer to this question. It took you 40 years. This is a compendium of the last 40 years of your work. Isn't that true?
Yeah, we've managed to publish 18 papers in peer-reviewed journals to date, and we've been able to bring the results of our original research plus other people's research together in what we hope is an understandable compilation of the material that's known about fasting, and as well as our own speculations about, what we think is going on.
Well, I can say to you as a writer that I admired the book very much. It's a very tightly written book. It is compelling, it is insightful, and there isn't a word wasted. So I commend this book to all my listeners. Let me ask you this. In 40 years of fasting over 25,000 patients, exactly how many have you lost?
Well, so far, none. Everybody that's walked in has been able to walk out, and we're trying very hard to keep it that way because we don't want to mess up our safety data.
Okay. Now, but when you started this, you must have been such a young man starting this clinic 40 years ago. Were you worried then that it was a dangerous protocol?
Well, when we started doing fasting supervision in 1984, there wasn't a fasting safety study that had been completed. There wasn't, but there was a lot of people that had experience with fasting. And, Moses, David, Elijah, Jesus, there's all kinds of references. Every major religion has a tradition about fasting. I went to chiropractic college in the United States and osteopathic college in Australia. And in Australia, where I was studying, with a gentleman named Alec Burton, he had the most experience in the world at the time in terms of doing human subjects fasting. And so I got to learn from somebody that had fasted tens of thousands of people. And, he was able to impart upon me the things he had learned, the mistakes he had made. And so we were able to, not have to go through it the hard way and start from scratch, so to speak.
Okay. Well, let me start with the one or two things that confuse me about the subject. And the book. And first is this, that there are advocates of the keto diet out there, people like the author Gary Taubes. And they make the case that if you eat meat and cheese all day long, which of course you and I do not recommend, and if you get something like 80% of your calories from fat, your body will start burning fat as fuel, specifically ketone bodies. These are compounds like 3-beta hydroxybutyrate that I wouldn't recognize if it hit me over the head. And they believe that there's something magically healthy about getting into a state of ketosis in which fat rather than glucose is burned as fuel. Now, with fasting, the same end result happens. You're bringing patients to the state of ketosis. So talk to us about that distinction. When both the overly fatty diet and the fasting diet brings people to ketosis.
Well, what they're trying to do is kind of mimic some of the effects of fasting, but without actually having to do fasting. And so when you eliminate all carbohydrates from the diet, your body has to search for other sources of fuel. And those other sources of fuel are burning fat and protein through a process called lipolysis or gluconeogenesis. And so it is true, if you don't eat carbohydrates, your body will convert to a state of ketosis. But it's a fasting mimicking effect. It's trying to copy that effect. It's not the same thing as fasting. And what's good for short-term gain is not necessarily good for long-term health. And so, there's been, throughout the recent times, there's been many different people, including people like the dead Dr. Atkins, may his fillet of soul rest in peace, that have advocated high-fat, high-protein diets for weight loss. And because one of the effects of fasting and the ketosis that's associated with fasting is a hunger blunting effect. So you can go on a high-fat, high-protein diet, and you will have a hunger blunting effect. The problem is, in the long run, you're going to make yourself sick. And so high-fat, high-protein diets have been, well investigated, and we know that everything from gallbladder disease to increased heart disease and cancer are consequences. Yes, you may lose weight short-term, but, I tell people if their only goal is weight loss, they can just get out a chainsaw and cut off their leg at the hip and lose 40 pounds overnight. I mean, that's the fastest way. It may not be healthy. We wouldn't necessarily advocate it. But certainly if the only goal is short-term weight loss and you're not worried about long-term health, there's even faster ways than going on high-fat, high-protein diets. But we don't recommend it. On the other hand, fasting does have a hunger blunting effect. That's why when you can go on a long-term fast up to 40 days, you won't necessarily be hungry. Hunger goes away, as a consequence of this fasting effect. It's also true that some of the detoxification that occurs in fasting does it much more efficiently than it does in a fasting mimicking program. There's also good long-term safety data looking at actual fasting and its health benefits, but some very controversial data looking at what happens long-term with high-fat, high-protein diets.
Now, does it take an obese person longer to attain that state of ketosis than it would take a slender person?
No, pretty much everybody goes into ketosis relatively quickly. Depending on what your glycogen reserves are, will determine how long you'll stay in the high glucose state rather than converting over to fat. So you might have a thin person with large glycogen reserves, and they may be able to last a little bit longer. Being overweight doesn't necessarily give you an indication of what those glycogen stores are.
Okay. Now, is it the ketosis itself that has some positive effect, or is the ketosis just a marker that the fast is working and that's what needs to happen next?
Well, it's one of the changes that occur, one of the many changes that occur with fasting. And it may be, in fact, that being in a state of ketosis has some beneficial effects. One of the effects we already talked about, which is there's a hunger blunting mechanism that goes along with that. And there's many other changes that occur in fasting, but I think we're going to find that just being in ketosis itself isn't going to approximate the changes that occur in fasting, which is why you don't see all of the benefits of high protein, high fat diets that you do with fasting. But one of the side effects that you do see is that people can be on high fat, high protein diets and not be experiencing hunger. And that's particularly true for people that are used to eating refined carbohydrates. 86% of the carbohydrates people eat in industrialized countries are sugar and refined flour products. And as a consequence, they drive insulin up, which drives sugar down. And that's where your binging and craving and difficulties people have of skipping a meal or two go, because they're basically banging on that system and depleting that system. And so they can't go and skip a meal without being in acute distress.
Now, some people say that ketosis is associated with some negatives like bad breath and brain fog. Is there a truth to that?
Well, there's no question that you will get ketone bodies will come off in the breath, and so you will have a different odor there. People are certainly not used to that. It's certainly not necessarily considered a desirable effect. People don't go into fasting because they're hoping to experience that wonderful fasting breath. There's many things that happen in fasting that can be considered intense and miserable as secondary side effects, depending on how well people prepare for fasting. The good news is, though, if you achieve your goals, which is the weight loss, the detoxification, normalizing the sympathetic tone, reducing the masses, restoring a state of health, increasing BDNF, et cetera, the negatives of fasting are oftentimes outweighed, which is why we're still around and people are still coming in to do fasting, because hopefully the benefits outweigh the inconveniences. And the fasting that we do, that is the long-term water-only fasting, has other downsides in that it does require supervision. In other words, you have to have a medical history, a physical exam, and laboratory monitoring. Make sure a person's a good candidate for fasting. Not everybody is. That you fast the appropriate duration, and most importantly, that you terminate the fast appropriately, that there's appropriate careful refeeding, because you want to avoid serious consequences like refeeding syndrome or post-fasting edema or other things that can happen when people, if they fast inappropriately. The other concern is people need to rest when they're fasting. If they're more active, they'll lose more weight, but it won't be more fat. What they'll be doing is just mobilizing their lean tissues. One of the great benefits of fasting, as we demonstrated in a study recently that we conducted with a DEXA scanner, is that in fasting, the body primarily will burn fat and preferentially burn visceral fat. And that turns out to be highly important. Right now, people in our society are fat, sick, and miserable. The extra fat is associated not with just extra subcutaneous tissues, but also with something called visceral fat. And visceral fat is the fat that accumulates around the belly and in the organs, and it acts like a tumor. It's hypermetabolic, and it gives off inflammatory products. It's associated with increasing risk for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disease, just in general, premature death and disability. Even during our recent epidemics, our pandemics, that one of the big vulnerables for death from COVID was obesity. It wasn't really talked about much because it's considered politically incorrect to blame people because they're maintaining extra fat, particularly extra visceral fat. But that extra visceral fat is responsible for much of the disease that you see in society today. And if you said to somebody, look, you have a 3 or 4 pound tumor that you're carrying around and it's giving all kinds of inflammatory products, nobody would question that that might be compromising their health. Well, that's essentially what you're doing when you have visceral fat, is you have a multi-pound tumor that's busy trying to undermine your health. And so getting rid of that visceral fat is very important. And it turns out in fasting, the body preferentially mobilizes visceral fat. For example, a study that we did looking at what happens to body composition. Say a person loses 12% of their total weight, which is not uncommon in a 2 to 3 week fast. And they might lose 20% of their fat, but more than 50% of their visceral fat. So it's just like if you lose 10% of your body weight, you don't necessarily lose 10% of your tumor. The body preferentially may mobilize 50% or 100% of the tumor during fasting. Well, the body doesn't, it preferentially mobilizes visceral fat because it shouldn't be there. It's not something that would normally be there, particularly not in quantity. And as a consequence, the body has its ability to go in there and do that. And that's one of the great benefits of fasting, is it can go in there and get rid of some of this tissue that shouldn't be there. One of the effects of fasting is increasing autophagy. And as the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2016 from Yoshinori Ashumi was awarded for his tremendous work on showing how important autophagy is in getting rid of cancer and age cells, et cetera, one of the things that happens in fasting is a profound increase in autophagy.
And autophagy is removing waste products from cells, is that right?
It's actually how the body's immune system goes in there and eats up, eliminates and recycles aged, decrepit cells and cancer cells. So when you're detoxifying and fasting, when you're mobilizing PCB, dioxin, pesticide residues, heavy metals, et cetera, those are all enzymatically driven processes. And those enzyme systems are induced during fasting and they persist after fasting. So presumably you're detoxifying not just while you're fasting, but in the days, the weeks, the months after fasting. And it appears to be cumulative. So every time people fast, they get better and better at detoxifying, just like every time you exercise, you get better and better at mobilizing glycogen stores from glycolysis. And so even the 16-hour fast that we recommend people do every day, that is, don't eat 3 hours before you go to bed, maybe delay breakfast till you do some exercise in the morning. That short period of fasting, day after week after month, is thought to induce some of these positive changes. And when you do a long fast, like we talk about from 5 to 40 days, all but in a controlled setting, that induces those changes geometrically. And so every time somebody gets the opportunity to fast, they're building on that efficiency of their detoxifying enzyme systems and their macronutrient enzyme systems. So the lipolytic enzyme systems, the glycogen mobilizing systems, even the protein mobilizing systems are all enhanced during this process.
Now, with visceral fat, sometimes people aren't obese, but they're 10, 15 pounds overweight. They say, I'm just
Yeah.
trying to get rid of this spare tire. Is that likely to be the visceral fat?
Well, the visceral fat particularly accumulates around the belly and in the organs. And so sometimes people are not necessarily that big, but they're still over fat because they're not active enough. They're deconditioned. They're storing a higher percent body fat, a lower percent muscle than they should. And in order to resolve that can take some rather dangerous and radical interventions. You might have to eat well, exercise, get enough sleep, and maybe even consider intermittent or long-term fasting. So those interventions are considered quite radical, which is true. They are radical because that comes from what radicus means, root or cause. And so by dealing with the root or cause of the problem, which is inadequate diet, inadequate activity, inadequate rest, you can actually give the body a chance to do what it does best, and that's heal itself.
Now, how often do you fast?
I fast every day for 12 to 16 hours. I don't eat 3 to 4 hours before I go to sleep. I often do my exercise early in the morning before breakfast. And I try in that 8-hour window, I limit myself to an exclusively whole plant food diet that's free of SOS. SOS is the international symbol of danger, and it stands for the chemicals that we put in our food that make us fat, sick, and miserable. And those chemicals are salt, oil, and sugar. So a diet that's exclusively from whole plant foods that doesn't have added salt, oil, or sugar is a diet that's going to be around 10% of calories from protein, 15 to 18% of calories from fat, with the balance from whole plant food carbohydrates. And that's what we believe will not only help you get healthy today, but it can help you keep healthy through what's hopefully a good life and then a good death, where you go to sleep one night and don't wake up, rather than spend the last 10 or 20 years of your life unable to talk or move, lying in some nursing home bed because you had a stroke or heart attack because you listened to somebody that told you to go on some high-fat, high-protein diet.
Now, you suggested 15 to 18% of your calories as fat. That is, of course, far less than the average American eats. It's also a bit higher, I think, than Dr. McDougall says.
Well, if you're talking about the average person that's trying to stay healthy, that would include some foods in the diet like nuts, seeds, avocado in limited quantities that are excluded in diets that are specifically designed to deal with active cardiovascular disease, which might be more of the 10 to 12% of calories from fat. But what we found is that a person that's on a 15 to 18% of calories from fat diet will still reverse their cardiovascular disease. And it's a sustainable long-term diet that doesn't run into any of the problems of the ultra low-fat diets that occasionally crop up. And so, again, there's no harm in reducing the fat even further for specific therapeutic intervention. But the general diet we're advocating is a whole plant food diet that does include limited quantities of these highly nutritious foods like nuts and seeds, avocado, etc., but doesn't use oil, salt, or sugar. This is a highly palatable, relatively easy to comply with diet once you neuroadapt and get out of the addictive cycles where you're hooked into salt, oil, and sugar.
All right, let me ask you another question from my reading of the book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? And of course, the answer, spoiler alert, is yes. You mentioned that in one of your own studies on overweight and obese patients on prolonged water-only fast, their levels of inflammation and triglycerides rose as anticipated,
Yes.
you wrote, and then fell below baseline once refeeding took place.
Yes.
So why did these things, inflammation, triglyceride levels, get worse before they get better?
Right. Well, so keep in mind that inflammation is generated by the body in an attempt to heal itself. It's chronic inflammation that frustrates people when the inflammation is not successful. And during fasting, acute chronic problems can have a chance to develop an acute phase where the body actually goes through and heals them. And during that phase, acute phase reactive proteins and other markers of inflammation will in fact go up. So will, for example, there's an adaptation in fasting to where you're burning fat instead of glucose. And when you first come off the fast in those first days, it takes the body a while to shift back metabolically to burning glucose. And so if you too rapidly refeed, that increased insulin resistance may allow you to have problems. That's why recovering from fasting in a controlled setting is really a good idea, to regulate your intake so you don't overload. Because the tendency, of course, is, oh, you haven't eaten, now you want to eat a lot. So you want to resist that, because initially HOMO-IR, which is a measure of insulin resistance, will be higher. But then if you follow those patients, which we did in the study, at 6 weeks, not only is it back to normal, it's actually much lower. And that's why 80% of our type 2 diabetics can achieve normal blood sugar without medication if they're willing to do the diet and the exercise. Inflammatory markers go up during fasting, but the overall inflammation comes down dramatically. And that's why you see such tremendous healing in autoimmune disease, where the body's attacking itself. Rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, ankylosing spondylitis, lupus, psoriasis, eczema. These conditions respond dramatically. In fact, if you look in our book, we have a great case report with pictures of plaque psoriasis and showing before, after fasting, and then on follow-up, how well people are able to do. And that same inflammatory drop is associated with recovery from cardiovascular disease. And we have some fabulous data talking about retrospective data, 174 consecutive patients with hypertension, 174 people lowering their pressure enough to eliminate medication, with the largest effects that have ever been shown in treating human beings with high blood pressure. And prospective studies we did with our colleagues from the Mayo Clinic, where of 29 people, 28 people complete the study, 28 out of 29 are off medication, one is in a half dosage. And we followed those people at 6 weeks and showed that the majority of them were able to maintain their blood pressure, drug-free state, and maintain weight loss. And what may be even more impressive is we followed up on those patients at a year to determine, would these people be able to maintain this radical dietary change well enough to maintain weight loss and blood pressure and drug-free state. And 75% of those subjects were able to maintain their weight loss, even though they weren't all perfect with the diet. But that's dramatically higher than pretty much anything I've seen followed. So it does show that highly motivated patients are able to make and maintain these dietary changes. But it is probably one amongst the more difficult things you would ask a patient to do, because they're living in a world designed to make them fat, sick, and miserable, and give them what they want, not what they need. And so everywhere they go, their success is going to be undermined by people who are giving them really bad advice for their own reasons and their own motivations.
Right. Well, your remarkable results with blood pressure are particularly dispositive, because that's one metric that, as far as I know, everybody agrees upon. I don't think there's anyone out there who says that high blood pressure is good for you. So when you're dealing with that metric, it becomes a really convincing case. Define for us the term refeeding syndrome and what you've learned about it over the last decades.
Well, there's a good amount of literature with refeeding syndrome. We actually have no experience with it because we've never had a case of refeeding syndrome, because we use a controlled refeeding pattern to avoid that. So it's completely avoidable. But if you take a person that's in the fasting state, particularly for a prolonged period of time, and put them on some greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh diet, they can get sick from the metabolic adaptation of trying to get back into the feeding state. So their electrolytes get out of whack. That can have cardiac problems. It can be serious or fatal. So refeeding syndrome was particularly discovered during World War II, as they were liberating camps, and they allowed people to refeed too quickly who'd been in a starvation mode for prolonged periods of time. Now, keep in mind, these people were not actually fasting. They were in a deprivation mode for period, and were more vulnerable to refeeding syndrome even than our fasting patients might be. But the point is, it was recognized that if you allowed people to eat too much too quickly, they could get very sick. And it's termed refeeding syndrome. And it essentially is, physiological alterations that occur from too rapid a realimentation. So what we do is we have a very specific protocol that we follow for coming off the fast. And so far, that's been 100% successful at avoiding refeeding syndrome. There's also something called post-fasting edema. If people go and eat like salty food, if they go out to a restaurant, eat some soup or something right after fast, the body will suck up those minerals, bring fluid along with it, and then you get swelling in the legs, and it can lead to congestive heart failure and other problems. So it's important that the protocol we follow is that the first half the length of the fast, so a 20-day fast would be a 10-day controlled refeeding period. And if you follow that protocol, it works so far all the time.
Well, of course, the fast is just a stepping stone to then eating the correct human diet. How did you learn how to eat correctly. You became a vegan at what age?
Well, I became a complete vegan at age 16.
At 16.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Where did you grow up, and what made you make that change?
Well, I grew up in Long Beach, California, and I really liked playing basketball. And my best friend, Doug Lyle, also liked playing basketball, but he beat me badly all the time. And so it got me frustrated because I wanted to beat him. So I started reading books to try to see if I could get an edge to be able to beat him. And I came across a book by Herbert Shelton. And it said that health was that had causes, just like disease had causes. And so if you wanted to cause health, you had to live healthfully. And that involved diet, sleep, and exercise. And he also talked about fasting to undo the consequence of unhealth. And so I thought, well, why don't I do that and I'll get healthier and then I'll be able to beat Dr. Lyle. The problem was it failed miserably because he adopted the same dietary habits. And here I am, 65 years old. He still beats my butt every time we play. So it was not successful at helping me, but it did get me interested in this idea of causing health. And I was also very much inspired by my uncle, who was a medical doctor. And he was a medical doctor who did not believe in alternative health at all, or in nutrition for that matter. And when I was 16, I had already decided that I wanted to pursue alternative medicine as a career. And I mentioned that to my family. It happened to be at my 16th birthday. And my uncle was very upset. And he said, no, that's not acceptable, that nobody in this family would ever go to a doctor like that, let alone become a doctor like that. He said, better you should be a communist spy. And he was very upset. I thought I was going to witness my first stroke because his veins were sticking out in his neck. And anyway, finally he went away. And my father, who was a pretty serious character, took me aside. And he said, son, I don't know anything about this alternative medicine. He says, but anything that makes him that angry and mad, it can't be bad. So stick to your guns and good luck to you.
Well, good for him.
Yeah. So, that was my inspiration. I went to Australia and I was doing osteopathic study and I was seeing these patients get well with fasting. And I called my uncle and I said, Uncle, I'm seeing hypertension resolve. He says, no, you're not. I said, no, I'm seeing it resolve over and over again. I'm taking their blood pressure. He says, then you don't know how to take blood pressure. He says, I've been in practice for 50 years. They never get better. So I said, well, I'll come back. I'll do a study. Will you help me? He says, no. He won't help me. He said he won't even look at our data until it's published in a peer-reviewed journal. He wouldn't waste his time. So finally, we come back with the help of T. Colin Campbell from Cornell and Dr. Lyle. We put this study together. It took us a long time. We finally got the data. We got it submitted. It was rejected by 30 medical journals. We finally got a peer-reviewed journal that accepted it for publication. 2 months before it actually came out, my uncle died of a massive heart attack. And my mother swore he died just so we wouldn't have to admit he was wrong. But I think it was the Kugel and the Kreplach and the Knishes and the Blintzes, but we'll never know.
Yeah, I think we do know. But let's go back to when you're 16. You read that book, you decide that you want to have a health promoting diet, but how do you know what a health promoting diet is? And did you share that book with Doug Lyle? How did he know the same thing?
Yeah, he read the book too. And we talked about it, but it said that you had to eat a whole plant food diet. So fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. It said, don't eat meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar. And we said, okay, we'll try that.
So you just believed the book?
Well, he cited a lot of literature, and we started reading other books. There was a book called Psychodietetics. There was some other material back then. It wasn't like it is today. Right. And then, the first book that really did a great job of reviewing the scientific literature, I actually didn't read until I was already in chiropractic college, and it was John McDougall's book, The McDougall Plan.
Sure. And
the McDougall Plan made a very compelling case that a whole plant food diet would be, a better way to go. And then, of course, Dean Ornish and Esselstyn and all these other guys came along, and there was additional materials that were produced. And then, of course, the brilliant books by T. Colin Campbell, who was a co-author of our studies, but he wrote Whole and China Study. And, and now The Future of Nutrition. So, there's been a lot of research, a lot of work done. Our focus has been, and is summarized in this book, Can Fasting Save Your Life, is on fasting. We review the nutritional realities that we think are important, but most of the book is about our original research and summarizing other people's research on what's been done with fasting and how fasting turns out to be one of the great tools at reversing the consequence of dietary excess. You still have to do the diet, sleep, and exercise afterwards, but it's a fabulous facilitating tool. And we've been able to prove that in many conditions that people think you can't do anything about, you actually can do something about it with the benefits of fasting.
So
All right, if you've ever wanted to show off your plant-based lifestyle and do it in style, here's your chance. We have some of the most amazing t-shirts, hats, accessories, coffee mugs, and more at shop.realmeneatplants.com. We have statement t-shirts that will bring a smile to everyone's face. I love the I want tofu tonight tee. Plus, we have podcast tees, Real Women Eat Plants gear, Real Kids Eat Plants, and Real People Eat Plants, just in case men, women, and kids didn't cover it all. Yeah, we love you and love that you want to show off that healthy lifestyle of yours. Again, check out our high-quality gear at shop.realmeneatplants.com and enjoy.
So at 16, you read this book, you gain a good insight into what is the healthiest human diet. You make the mistake of sharing the book with Doug Lisle. He gains the same insight. You become a chiropractor. He becomes a psychologist. This has always been a little confusing to me because you are both dietary experts who went into a slightly different field. Do you do what chiropractors do? I think of chiropractors as manipulating spines and so forth. Do you do that sort of work?
I do. What it happens, my interest was in fasting supervision. And at the time that I went to school, medical doctors could not do fasting supervision. That was considered criminal quackery. Chiropractors were more interested in alternative medicine. And ultimately, I went to osteopathic college because Dr. Burton, who was the president of the Pacific College of Osteopathic Medicine, had a facility that specialized in fasting supervision. So I got my well-versed in manual therapy. And, chiropractic has tremendous utilization when people have back pain and headaches and neck pains and mobility issues. And although I wasn't particularly interested in that part of medicine when I went to school, I found, this had great utility. And a lot of the people we see have these problems. And if you can alleviate their symptoms, you can get their attention and, grind in on the diet and lifestyle. And of course, nutrition has always been an important part of chiropractic training. So even in school, we learned about nutrition, we learned about fasting, and both in chiropractic and osteopathic college. Medical training has very limited focus on nutrition. I mean, their attitude is, why would you think what you put in your mouth will have anything to do with health? I mean, it just doesn't seem very logical to most physicians. Now, that's starting to change. You have a whole field in medicine, lifestyle medicine and functional medicine, where medical doctors who've become disenchanted with the pill, potion, powder approach are now embracing these lifestyle approaches of nutrition and body use, et cetera. But I think that the chiropractors have a long tradition of being supportive of this approach. And so it made a lot more sense if I'm going to practice, I didn't want to end up in jail. So, I pursued the areas that would actually help me gain interest into what I was interested in. I wasn't interested in pharmaceutical application nor surgical applications. I was interested in health promotion, health prevention. So it made sense that chiropractic and osteopathic training was more relevant to me than perhaps some alternative approach.
So
Dr. Lisle was interested in why people do what they do. And we had a tremendous argument early on because, we've known each other since fourth grade. We've talked about doing this work for our whole lives. And I said, well, all you have to do is figure out how to get people well, and then they do it, and then they'll do it. And he said, well, no, they won't. They'll do it for a while, but then when their motivation of pain, debility, or fear of death eases, they'll go back to their old addictive bad habits. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. Why would somebody knowing full well what to do not do it? And he said, well, because they're human beings, and human beings, have all of these issues. And so it turns out, again, he was right. And adherence ends up being the big cornerstone, and he's particularly interested in that. And so, he's laid out very clearly in The Pleasure Trap why it is people have trouble making changes. We've talked about in Can Fasting Save Your Life how you have to undo it. And Dr. Lisle's newest book that'll be coming out hopefully soon, he lays out a good explanation of what it takes for people to actually understand what motivates them and perhaps how they can make those changes. So I think ultimately we'll be able to get this information clearly elucidated.
Well, what's odd about this story is that apparently you were talking to Doug Lyle about practicing alternative health together when you were in fourth grade,
Yes.
and you've been doing it. When I was in fourth grade, I talked to my friend Danny about playing for the New York Yankees together. We knew
Yeah.
that we weren't going to actually do it, but somehow your childhood fantasies became realities. Were you surprised along the way?
No, as a matter of fact, you think about other people on the spectrum, sometimes they get interested in spiders or dinosaurs or whatever, and they become obsessed with that. I happen to get interested in fasting. And so, that was part of that pathway. And, it's true. I've been, really not done anything else, through school. And, I got into school really young and I got through school, and I've been doing this every day for 40 some years now. And it still is interesting to me today as ever. Part of it is the challenge is not only how to get people well, we know how to do that now, but how to motivate them to stay on the track so they can maintain the long-term results. And that's really the key, is not just knowing what to eat, how to live so you can get well, but then once you're well, staying that way. And
Right.
staying that way in a world that's not designed to be that supportive. And so that's really where our challenges are. We know what conditions respond. We know how to do that. We've done it a lot. We've been publishing data in peer-reviewed journals to prove that what we're saying, it sounds too good to be true, but it's not. It works. It works consistently. It's predictably. Other people can do the same thing. All of the information we have is freely available. None of it's proprietary. And it's all available. If people go to our websites, they can read all of the information. It's all there. If they get the book, Can Fasting Save Your Life?, they'll know everything we know that's relevant about getting and staying healthy.
All right, let's tell the audience what your websites are. One is fasting.org.
Fasting.org is our foundation's nonprofit research site that lists all of the literature and provides an active search tool where people can search the fasting literature. And the TrueNorth Health Center's website is truenorthhealth.com. And that's where, if they want to get a free phone conversation with me, all they have to do is go on and fill out the forms. I'll review their history and talk to them about pointing them in the right direction.
Now, you were talking about keeping people healthy who are healthy, and you've said that you believe one of the salient benefits of your protocol may be for the healthy, to keep us healthy.
We did a study recently where we looked at healthy people, metabolically healthy people, and what happens to them when they fast. And we looked at cardiometabolic risk factors and other factors. It turns out that as helpful as fasting is in sick people, proportionally, the changes in healthy people were even greater than sick people. It may be that the people that get the most benefit from this periodic fasting are actually healthy people that are doing something preventatively to stay healthy.
But
And
how
so
do you
we're going
measure
to be doing
that?
a major study looking at that very question. Here's the biggest challenge, though, in doing research on healthy people is today only 12% of people, or 12.5% of people, are metabolically healthy.
Mhm.
And only 2.7% of people actually have the most fundamental components of healthful living in terms of diet, not smoking, maintaining adequate percent body fat, et cetera. So the vast majority of people are fat, sick, and unhappy, unhealthy. And so as a consequence, it's very difficult to recruit healthy people now. Where we found most of the people for our study were actually working at the TrueNorth Health Center, where they live and work there, eat that way, and they were able to maintain metabolic health. But it's very hard to find free living people today that are actually healthy.
You don't ever do remote support for fasting, do you? It's always
We
on
do.
site?
So
Oh,
we
you do?
have doctors with extensive experience that provide remote support, but it has to be done in conjunction with a local family doctor, because there's some lab testing and other things that need to be available to the patient. But if the patient has a supportive medical doctor, naturopath, chiropractor, somebody that can help them with physical monitoring, our doctors can provide them remote coaching and provide their doctors remote coaching. In fact, the book that we've written, Can Fasting Save Your Life?, has all the information in it that a physician would need to help their patient get through a fast appropriately. The testing that needs to be done, interpreting that testing, the adverse event concerns. So any physician that has Can Fasting Save Your Life would have the tools available to help a person determine, are they a good candidate for fasting, and provide monitoring and support. And our doctors provide remote coaching to help them get through the practical questions that come up. And so in order to take advantage of that, we have this extensive telemedicine practice available. So anybody anywhere in the world that has an interest and is an appropriate candidate would be able to take advantage of that.
Okay. Now, when you're working with healthy patients, how do you measure success?
So we measured cardiometabolic risk factor. For example, the same measures you measure in healthy people, like their weight, their blood pressure, their cholesterol levels, their acute phase reactive proteins. And even though they're within normal limits, they are what is considered healthier as a consequence of fasting. So the percent body fat's the inflammatory marker. So even though they weren't abnormal to begin with, they've become even closer to what's considered optimum health. You know, waist circumference, for example, the patients had about a 2-inch less circumference of the waist. It wasn't that they were obese or even overweight, but they were thinner, healthier, leaner, meaner, lower percent body fats. So any measure, current measure of health seems to be accentuated as a consequence of not just healthy living, but also with fasting.
Okay. Let's talk about the SOS diet that you mentioned earlier. I'll confess that I don't have sugar. I don't have oil except a few times a year when I go to a restaurant and I feel I can't avoid it. But I do have some foods with salt. My blood pressure, I once spoke to you about this. My blood pressure will tend to be something like 110/70. And you said that's good, but it would be even better if it was 95/65. There's that case to be made that if I avoided salt altogether, my blood pressure might go from good to better.
Well, we want to be clear. We're not talking about avoiding salt altogether. We're just avoiding added salt. You still get the sodium
right.
chloride you need in your whole
Right.
food, just like you get the carbohydrates and the essential fats you need.
Right. But the added salt that I have, for example, I might buy a can of organic beans.
Yes.
But
so
it's
what we
not
would
salt
suggest you
free.
buy unsalted beans going forward.
Right.
All beans are available unsalted.
Right. So instead of getting unsalted beans, I might get a can of beans with sea salt and it has 130 milligrams of salt, something like that.
Which you could then rinse and probably get most of that excess salt out of the way.
Which I do. Or I eat bread, and I want to talk to you about bread, but I eat bread and that is made with salt.
So let's talk about bread a little bit. If you take the salt out of bread and the oil and the sugar, it's called matzah, and it's punishment on Passover. So without salt and without the other additives, most people are not that excited about bread. So bread is actually a carrier agent. And at 1,500 calories a pound, before you turn it into a butter boat, it's very difficult for people that are eating significant quantities of that material to maintain optimum weight. So it's not that necessarily bread itself is the worst food in the world. It's just that it's one of the foods that makes it possible to maintain obesity. Salt stimulates passive overeating. If you remove the salt, it's very difficult to sustain overeating. And so basically, the reason salt makes you fat isn't the calories in salt. There's no calories in salt. It's completely free of any calories. But it stimulates dopamine production in the brain, and dopamine is the neurochemical associated with pleasure. And so when you salt food, you will eat more before your natural satiety mechanisms kick in. And that's why you and me and any animal on the planet that eats these highly processed foods is more vulnerable to obesity.
All right. Well, let me play advocate for my local artisanal baker. And they make a sourdough bread, and the ingredients are organic wheat flour, water, organic freshly stone milled whole wheat or rye flour, sea salt. Now, I know you're against the sea salt. Are you also against the flour?
Yeah, the wheat, anytime you turn a grain into a flour, you increase caloric density from 500 to 1,500 calories a pound. So again, overeating becomes an issue.
But is wait a minute, is caloric density something I need to worry about when I'm at my high school weight?
Well, the thing is, if your high school weight is ideal weight percent body fat, maybe not. But a lot of people are a little bit overweight in high school as well as they are as an adult.
I'm 5'8", 142.
So the question is not so much what your weight is, because you could be 182 if you wanted to spend all day in the gym and put on a bunch of muscle and still have low percent body fat. Because you're not having to struggle with weight, because you're only using a small amount of these materials, it may not be as dominant an issue for you for the 62% of people that are overweight or obese in society. But the reason, it's just like, some people can have a drink and not become a drunk. If you're a drunk, it's not you. And some people can have a bit of bread or a bit of this or that and not get overweight. But if you're overweight, it's not you. If you could have controlled it, you would have controlled it. And therefore, you've maybe able to draw lines so that you're able to sustain optimum weight and still make some variations. But let's not pretend that that's a healthful variation. It's something you like to do. It's something you choose to do. And maybe you're getting away with it. But it wouldn't be ideally desirable. What would be ideally desirable is to eat an exclusively whole plant food diet that's free of added salt, oil, and sugar. And I would suggest, let's just do an experiment. Let's do that for 5 years. And then let's see where you're at. Because what you'll find is you may not be 142, you might be 138. You may find that your cholesterol may not be 150, but it might be 132. You may find that, your level of functionality, your cognitive capacities, your athletic performance might be slightly enhanced. Now, granted, it would be a lot more obvious if we could get a regular person that was overweight and had all kinds of problems. With you, it's dealing with the fine tuning. But what we found in our study was that it's the person like you that actually it gets the most benefit because of those proportional fine tuning effects.
Now, the fact that bread is made with flour, does flour cause inflammation?
For a significant percentage of the people, the gluten, the protein in wheat, rye, and barley seems to be a problem, particularly modern wheat, where they've they've hybridized the wheat. So it's got, you get like 10 times as much wheat per acre as you used to get. The stuff doesn't blow over in the wind. It stands straight up. It's great for harvesting. They've genetically modified this stuff. And particularly for a third of the population, 1% of the population, if they eat that protein, they'll get what's called celiac disease, where the body's immune system will attack the intestinal tract, and it can be fatal if it's not addressed. Another percentage of the population have what's called the HLA-DQ gene. It's the gene associated with gluten sensitivity, and it's the same gene associated with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So patients that eat gluten, the immune system, instead of attacking the intestines, like celiac disease, it'll attack the thyroid, and you end up with what's called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, the most common cause of hypothyroidism. So for those people, that's probably not a good idea. Some people eat wheat and the gluten, and they get problems with joint pain, or they get sinusitis or other kind of, skin-related problems. So there's a lot of people that particular protein doesn't seem to work that well with. We just exclude gluten from all of our cookbooks and all of our recipes. We don't use wheat, rye, or barley, just because there's so many people that do seem to have some sensitivity. You may not. And some people can do something once a week, but if they do it every day, they start to get problems. So, if you rotate it in there, it may not be a catastrophe. But again, what are you using wheat for? Usually flour-based products. Flour-based products are highly concentrated, highly processed, high caloric density foods that, unless we're trying to gain weight, we pretty much want to try to avoid.
Well, first of all, let me say that if you talk me out of the rustic sourdough bread, that's one of my pleasures in life. Is that why you wear black all the time, Doc?
I tell patients that if they really want to know if they should eat something or not, what they should do is get very quiet and go inside themselves and say, do I really, 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 really want whatever it is? And if the answer is truly yes, you can't have it. You get nothing. Because if you really, really want it, it's probably banging on the pleasure trap.
Well, I'll have to talk with my wife. She wants me to eat the bread because she says I'm getting too skinny. So there you go.
Are you getting too skinny?
I think I'm just fine at my
see, the problem is if everybody else is fat, then by comparison, you look proportionally smaller. But lean and mean is usually associated with longer life and better health. So.
Right. I'm not really trying to gain weight, but I'm sustaining while eating bread. So I'll have to see. Tell us how fasting benefits the gut microbiome.
So a normal human being has about 1,000 different organisms, protozoa, bacteria, viruses, etc., living in their digestive system alone. And if you add them all up, it's trillions of creatures, about 5 pounds, they estimate, of these living organisms swimming around inside your intestinal tract, breathing and eating and defecating inside you. And what those organisms poo in you depends on what you feed them. So if you feed them meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products, you get, first of all, a completely different strain of organisms. And their poo is different than if you feed them plants. If you feed them soluble fiber, you get the kind of organisms that are associated with healthy people in plant-based guts. And instead of getting the TMA, which becomes trimethylamine oxidase and causes cancer and heart disease, you get vitamin K and fertilizer. So if you want your organisms pooing fertilizer in you instead of toxic waste, you want to feed them a whole plant food SOS-free diet and get rid of the meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar.
And fasting will help improve your enjoyment of the whole plant foods, right?
Well, fasting will cause a huge die-off of the microbiome. It's like rebooting the hard drive in a computer that's been corrupted. You don't know why. You turn the thing off, you turn it on, now it starts working better. When you fast, assuming you follow the fast with a carefully health-promoting probiotic diet, so in other words, fruits, vegetables, material, you will then regrow the organisms consistent with a plant-based diet and be able to resolve the problems where you get that imbalance associated with the sugars and all the processed crap that most people are eating. So most people have a dystrophic gut microbiome. And so you want to reboot that. One way to do that very effectively is to fast. Fasting turns out to be great. In fact, we have the first in a series of papers we did with Luigi Fontana from Washington University, just came out in the Lancet, preprints. And it looks at metabolic changes that occur in fasting. And the next paper is supposed to deal with these changes in the microbiome. It's really fairly complicated material. People that are representing that they've got that all figured out are probably not quite as far along the learning curve as they represent.
Now, on your water supervised fast, as I understand it, the water that people drink is distilled, steam distilled water. I've heard some make the case against distilled water that because it doesn't have minerals, I don't know, it leaches minerals from your bones or teeth. What's your answer to
People
that?
that used to advertise alternative treatment systems made up this thing about, oh, it's going to be hungry water, it'll suck all the minerals out of your body. And,
Right.
There's more minerals in one apple than the water you're going to be drinking today. So your water is not a primary source of absorbable minerals. And what you don't want in the water is the heavy metals, the contaminants, the hydrogen and hydrocarbons that form from the chlorine, et cetera, et cetera. So we just want pure water. Now, distilled water is what rainwater would be if the environment wasn't polluted. Distilled water is a mechanical way of heating water and then condensing it, so all you get is water. You can also use reverse osmosis. You could use any kind of effective treatment system to get out the chlorine, to get out the heavy metals, to get out the cryptosporidium. That's not so critical. It's just, you just want water, though. And fasting patients are very sensitive. They won't tolerate municipal water. And so we use distilled water, and in fact, we use laboratory-grade distilled water. It's pre-filtered, distilled, and post-filtered, just so that we don't have problems with people rejecting the water as they go through this fasting process. And our distillers make 50 gallons of distilled water a day, which is enough to keep our people, hydrated and in good shape.
Well, how do you feel about people who do fast but not on water, on carrot juice and celery juice or
Well, that's
herbal
not
tea?
fasting. That's juice fasting or diet, modified diets, and that's fine. People, in fact, where you're taking 600 or 800 or 1,200 calories a day is a safer process in the sense that you don't necessarily have to have the same level of medical supervision that you would for a water-only fast. Water-only fast, there has to be a medical history exam, lab, and monitoring in order to ensure that it's safe. Juice fasting is essentially eating on a no-fiber diet. And so those kinds of programs, and there's lots of intermittent fasting and modified fasting programs out there, can often be done by people at home without necessarily having to go through the supervision issues. It's not the same thing. You're in normal feeding physiology. You're not seeing some of the changes associated with fasting, but that can be good too. Sometimes fasting is so rapid, so intense, it may be too much for people. Some of the people staying at the center, we don't do water fasting. We'll do juice fasting or modified fasting to make sure that we don't have these issues that can be, a problem for water-only fasting. So water-only fasting is not for everybody, but for when it's indicated, there's nothing else quite like water-only fasting. Fasting mimicking programs can be tremendously helpful, but they're not exactly the same thing as water-only fasting.
Now, one of the great benefits of water-only fasting that we discussed earlier is the loss of visceral fat. I assume that could be achieved too on a carrot juice.
Well, anytime you lose weight, you lose visceral fat. The thing that's interesting about water fasting is the preferential mobilization of visceral fat. So it's just going to happen quicker. So, faster isn't always better. And honestly, if the only concern I had was weight loss, I'd say, let's go on a good diet, do exercise, get plenty of sleep, be patient. And eventually the fat, including the visceral fat, is going to get mobilized. But sometimes you have to be able to get people well enough so they can do the diet and lifestyle changes, because they're on a lot of meds, they're facing surgery, they have, we see a lot of really sick people. And so for those people, they don't have the luxury of time. or the ability until you can get them out of pain, because they can't even exercise because they're in too much pain. And so for us, water fasting has some great utility. But again, we're dealing with highly motivated patients in an inpatient setting that have the luxury of having the time to really focus on getting healthy quickly. For people that don't, all the information they need to get healthy is in our books. If you read The Pleasure Trap and you read Can Fasting Save Your Life, you'll know what you need to do to get healthy. The problem is doing it in the world that's difficult. And that's one of the advantages of TrueNorth Health Center, is people are sequestered in an environment that's supportive of health. And so they're not having to face all the well-meaning but misguided friends that are trying to undermine their success.
Well, I think that's one thing that you and I share. I think neither you nor I got the gene for caring what other people think. And so at 16, you went on this diet. I'm sure you got flack from it, and I'm sure you didn't care, right?
Yeah, that again, that's one of the great benefits of being on the spectrum, is that your emotional response is going to be very different than normal people are, and that's a great advantage in my business. If you worry about being outside the norm, it would be very difficult to do the work that I've been doing. When I first started out, I remember we used to get the police showing up. I remember one time a police officer came in and he said he wanted to interview one of my patients, and I asked him why, and he said because the relatives that called and complained that they were being held against their will by religious cultists and being starved to death so they could go to be with Jesus. And when I told the police officer that they were here voluntarily, he said, no, I have to interview him. I said, well, relax, I'll let you interview him, but first, would you like a nice tall cup of Kool-Aid? And Dr. Lau told me that I was politically incorrect, and that when a policeman puts his hand on his hip, that's not a sign he's comfortable, and that I'm not to speak to the authorities ever again.
Right.
Because I'm thinking it's an obvious joke, Kool-Aid's full of sugar. We wouldn't serve that at TrueNorth Health Center.
Yeah. Well, I had an incident with the police too. I think I was about 22 years old. I was living in Berkeley, California, and I decided that I would go write the great American novel. So I, took a pad and pen and went on the campus at UC Berkeley and just started writing. And next thing I know, no, I was starting to walk back home, but I was still on the campus, and a cop car goes behind me like I'm a car and he's pulling me over. He's just driving behind me, and then I hear stop, raise your hands. And I raised my hands, and he said, show me ID. And I didn't used to carry a wallet. I didn't have any ID. He said, what are you doing here? I said, I was trying to write a novel. And I said, it wasn't good. And that was the wrong thing to say. So now the questioning gets more aggressive, and a crowd starts to form. And I'm seeing all these people watching me getting arrested for some really bad writing. And finally, another car pulls up with, I guess, a witness to whatever the other crime had been. And I see a guy shake his head no, that I wasn't the guy. And they let me go, but with an attitude of like, don't do it again, buddy. So.
Well, at least they didn't confiscate your notepad.
Yeah. So we have those things in common. We spoke inappropriately to police officers, and we don't care what other people think. Is it possible that I'm on the spectrum too, and I just don't know?
I wouldn't have any idea.
How do do
We
out?
have to ask Dr.
Doug
Lyle.
Lyle?
He's the one that he did give me a test one time. We did the Big Five personality profile, and he said that he looked at a test that measures I'm just blanking on the actual term that's used to mean whether you get along with people or not. Well, in any case, one of the Big Five personality profiles measures agreeableness or disagreeableness. Yeah. Okay, and I came out 0 percentile, which means 100 out of 100 people would be more agreeable than I would. And we thought, well, maybe it's the test. And so we got a completely different validated test and we give it. And it turned out it was very different. I was 1 percentile. And it turned out that test, though, didn't give a 0 percentile. So it was still basically the same thing. So when it comes to being disagreeable, apparently 100 out of 100 people are likely to be more agreeable than I am. So I'm apparently not that easy to get along. But I have to say, in my defense, my wife, who's fabulous, we just had our 40th anniversary. So she's renewed my marriage contract every year for 40 years.
Wow.
Now, this year, I asked her if I could have a 2-year extension. Because I thought, after 40 years.
Yeah.
What'd you say? No, just 1 year at a time.
Just 1 year at a time? All right.
I have to say, my father was responsible for my success, though, because he told me he had been married 68 years. And he said the secret to a successful, and he was a math teacher, and he knew he saw everything from a mathematical perspective. And he said that in order to have a successful marriage, you have to understand the math of marriage.
What's
and
the math of
marriage is very simple. Women are right about 90% of the time, and men are right not so much. So if a husband always agrees with his wife, that means he'll be right at least 90% of the time. And if you get 90% right, you get an A. And so all you have to know as a male is the 2 magic words, which are yes, dear.
Right.
But you can't just say yes, dear. You got to say it like you mean it.
Right.
And so if you can practice saying that and always respond that way, you'll be right at least 90% of the time and you'll be successful. And every male I've talked to that's been married a long time successfully, they've learned that, that secret.
Yeah. I'm at almost 28 years now.
I would say you probably are pretty good at the magic words then.
Yeah, I've been saying them. Let me ask you this. When you adopted this diet at 16,
yes,
did you know about oil? Has the diet evolved over the years, or did you actually get it right from the beginning?
Well, there's been a little bit of fine tuning over the years, but essentially the diet was a whole plant food. So it was a vegan diet. So there was no meat, fish, eggs, or dairy products. And we understood that oil, salt, and sugar was an issue. We've gotten a little bit more aggressive about sodium and sodium contamination issues. Initially, it was thought that the minimum needs for sodium was higher than what they actually are. So we know now that actual need for sodium is limited, and you get all the sodium you need from whole foods. The question is of tolerance. How much can people get away? Like the little bit of salt you get in your bread, is that really enough to compromise your health? For healthy people, we don't know what the answer to that is yet. For sick people, we do know that, if you've got hypertension, if you've got weight issues, then we've got to get tight enough that you'll be successful. It may be, though, that healthy people have a little bit more flexibility, and particularly if you're not having an addictive tendency. Just like a person might occasionally have that glass of wine and not necessarily become a drunk or develop health. It doesn't mean it's healthy. It doesn't mean you should do it. But the question is what people's tolerances are may vary depending on their genetics, their use and abuse, their age, their history, etc.
But you've been eating essentially the same diet since you were 16?
Well, I had decided I was going to do it for 50 years as an experiment. And then after that, I'd reevaluate it. So I've still got a little bit more time to go. But, now I'm feeling like it's working. So I'm going to give it another 50 years and we'll see, if it keeps working.
So, and you never have bread?
I've had matzah, which doesn't have any oil, salt, or sugar, but I got news for you. There's not much tendency in wanting to overeat it,
No. Although it's nice and crispy. There's that.
Yeah. Crispy connotes fresh. What also connotes fresh is actual fresh. Like, for example, celery tastes good when it's fresh. It's kind of soggy and not so good when it's not fresh. And that's what your brain is thinking when you're getting that crunch, is that it's something must be fresh. So I just try to, go fresh.
Now, Dr. Esselstyn famously indulges on New Year's Eve. I think he has Reese's peanut butter cups or something like that. Do you ever have anything that would be considered an indulgence?
Well, not so far. Reese's peanut butter cups wouldn't ring my bell, but Dr.
Your
Esselstyn
mind.
is 90 years old and he's still hanging in there. So apparently that level of indulgence hasn't overwhelmed his adaptive capacity. So, and he's one of the sharper guys that I know. So, I'm not going to argue with his attributes. What I can tell you is that I had one food that I like that I had a tendency to overeat, and that were fresh raw cashews. And so, I feel that we really shouldn't use more than about an ounce a day of very concentrated foods like that. So what I did is I always store raw nuts in the freezer to keep them fresh. And so I would bring them out of the freezer and I would actually weigh out an ounce of cashews. And the rule was if I ever went back for seconds, then we wouldn't have cashews in the house anymore. And that was 38 years ago. We still have cashews in the house. Now, sometimes I've wanted to go back, but I have a strict rule. And anytime I'm tempted, I think, well, if I go back, then I don't get to have cashews. And I like cashews. So for me, that was enough of a rule to keep it from becoming an issue. Almonds, walnuts, no problem. By the time you shell 6 walnuts, you want to move on with your life. The tendency to overeat on that is much less. But the cashews come shelled, and so it's a little bit easier to overdo. So for me,
Well, here's a news flash.
that would
Walnuts
be a
can come
vulnerability.
shelled too.
Hmm?
Walnuts can come shelled too.
Yeah, but they're better in the shell because then by the time you open them up, you don't tend to overeat them.
Yeah. Yeah. Now let's talk about nuts. Nuts are a food they're of course highly fatty. There are any number of studies that claim that they're healthy and increase longevity and, say all kinds of positive things about nuts. Jeff Nelson did a video in which he claimed that more than claimed, it was clearly true, that many of those studies were in fact paid for by the nut industry. All the same, there seems to be some scientific support for the idea that nuts are perfectly healthy. But
in appropriate quantities.
Inappropriate quantities, yes.
The big bad problem about nuts is the tendency to overeat them, and how when they're processed into nut butters and other things, it's really easy to overdo it.
Right.
And so, because they're very concentrated, you just have to show them some respect.
Right. But let's assume they are healthy. If they are healthy, what makes them healthy is that they have a bunch of nutrients. They have protein and different minerals. They don't have any nutrients that you can't get elsewhere without the fat.
No, you can get everything you want without having to eat nuts. Some people have food issues with nuts where if they eat one, they can't stop. And so we'll tell them to go to seeds, or if they don't want to use seeds, we'll go to just more green vegetable materials. And that's fine. You can get everything you need from lots of different sources.
Right. So there's a case to be made that if you have any problem with nuts and if you have any weight problem, there's no reason why you need to have nuts.
For some people, a small amount of nuts in the diet provide a level of satiety feedback that's helpful. The higher fat intake helps them avoid overeating on carbohydrates. So there may be people that do get some benefit from a weight control standpoint with the inclusion, but certainly there's no food you can't exclude if you don't do well with it. There's no one food that's so magic that you can't function without it.
Right. I recently had bad news on a blood test about 6 weeks ago or so, 2 months ago. My cholesterol was high. My serum cholesterol was 199 and my LDL was off the charts for me at 135. And I asked myself, what am I doing wrong all of a sudden? Usually my serum cholesterol would be more like 160, 170, my LDL more like 100. And I said, maybe it's the nuts and maybe it's the fructose from dates. I was having 1 or 2 dates a day and bananas.
Well, let's do a little experiment. We pull the nuts, we pull the dates, the dried fruits,
did the
and we
experiment.
pull the bread. And then we retest, and then you add back things one at a time, and you'll be able to tell which of those highly concentrated foods is pushing you over the edge.
Well, I'm ahead of you because I cut out the bananas for a month, 3 weeks. I cut out the bananas for 3 weeks, cut out the dates, cut out the raisins. Now, mind you, it was a handful of raisins.
What happened to your weight?
The weight stayed the same, I think.
No change in weight.
Maybe I lost a pound or 2. I don't know.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Anyway, after 3 weeks, and you see, let me just say this. I was worried, as you could imagine, that I would get a heart attack, a massive cardiac arrest. And that would be just terrible for my podcast. So I was worried. So
But
I was
first
very
of all, you
strict.
need to know that cholesterol is not a good individual marker. And so what would be a better marker would be looking at acute phase-reactive proteins like CRP as far as predicting whether or not you're vulnerable. And chances are, even with your elevated cholesterol level for you, your CRP was probably low, which means you probably
CRP
never
was
really
between
were at risk.
0.25 and 0.5.
Yeah.
So after 3 weeks, without the dates, without the bananas, and without the nuts, I went from 199 to 154,
Yep.
and from 135 LDL to 94.
94.
So here's the question. And you've just kind of hinted at it with the talk about inflammation. Was I really getting healthier and reducing my chance of heart attack with those improvements? Or was I just chasing numbers that were irrelevant?
You were getting healthier probably, but you probably never were really at significant risk in any case, because again, these are epidemiological values that are useful for society, for populations as a whole. They're less sensitive for individual variation. So I don't know that you were ever at risk, but I do think you're healthier now as a consequence. I'd like to see what your numbers are when we get rid of the last of the refined carbohydrates, what happens to your weight and your overall sense of well-being. Because what our experience has been, it's people that are healthy that see the most changes with these subtle differences, including with fasting.
So you want me off the bread, huh?
When's the last time you did a fast?
It's been years now.
So
I've just done
come
20
to the center,
hours.
do a fast. Let's see what happens, and let's have you do a show from the center, and you can tell people what the experience of a healthy person fasting is like.
Okay, well, that's an idea.
Yeah.
And how long do I have to go?
Well, generally, healthy people are doing a short period of time. We're doing 5 to 7 days. It doesn't usually take a very long fast to get a big effect when you're starting out healthy. The important thing is you prepare properly. The 2 days before fasting are fruit, salad, and steamed vegetables only. No meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, sugar. No last chance to have whatever. And then you're ready to get into the fast effectively. You have a short fast. If you're stable after a week, you're done. So this isn't something that requires a long period of time to have a big impact. And in a person like yourself, it's not gonna have to be a long thing. You're already, doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Right.
Except for maybe a little bit of bread.
Yeah. So if you ever have a tempe sandwich, what do you have it on? Lettuce?
Well, I'm fortunate because I work at TrueNorth Health Center.
Yeah.
And so that's not a place where we serve all kinds of wonderful food, but it's not a place where they're serving bread and, that type of thing. So
yeah, but you can't have a sandwich without bread, can you?
well, you certainly can. We call them handwiches, but you have the same kind of wonderful toppings, but it might be in steamed cabbage leaves, or you might be using some non-glutinous substance. So if I was going to do something, I might use, say, a corn tortilla or a wrap. We make these vegetarian wraps out of vegetables. They're dried in the dryer, and they look like a burrito wrap, but they're made entirely of vegetables.
So you allow yourself to have corn tortillas?
Yeah, you might, again, tortillas, if you're struggling with weight, it's a flour product, so you better limit how many you're eating. But because I happen to be a little bit sensitive to wheat, so I don't usually use wheat just because of my own individual sensitivity. But if you're going to use a corn or something like that, that might give you some of what you're looking for in the convenience side. Or like I say, you can use these veggie wraps, which are great. They have the texture of a wrap, but without any kind of grain.
This is a processed food made from vegetables?
No, what we do is we take, there's a recipe, you take the material and you spread it out on a silicone thing and put it in the dehydrator, and it turns out to be like a wrap, like something that's made entirely of vegetables.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. I've never had that, I don't think.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting and innovative things out there nowadays that can give you the texture without actually having to put something in that can be sensitizing to you.
All right. Well, I've enjoyed this talk, Dr. Goldhamer. Everything about it except losing the bread. I'm not thrilled about that.
You get nothing. We'll get you a t-shirt.
All right. The book, again, is called Can Fasting Save Your Life? I hope this is a bestseller. It deserves to be. Everybody should read this.
Well, it's available right now as a pre-sale on
Amazon. You have a copy to hold up? There you go. Can fasting save your life? Oh, it's a little blurry. I don't know. Move it back.
I guess the
No?
quality of my camera is not so great.
Okay. Well, it says, can fasting save? Momentarily it was legible. Now save your life there you go. Can fasting save your life? By Dr. Alan Goldhamer. It is a very compelling read. I hope everybody gets it. Let's hope it's a bestseller. And you can pre-order it now, and it comes out in June. Is that right?
Yeah, it comes out in June. It's available on Amazon, and we're excited about it. It's actually a really good book. Dr. Myers, the director of research at the TrueNorth Health Center, has done just a fabulous job of bringing all of the scientific literature together and in a way that's comprehensible, that you can understand what it actually means.
Even I was able to follow it. So I found it, it just held my attention the whole way, and I did not snack once while reading it. So I feel
Excellent.
good about that. And I had no bread while reading it. All right. Thank you, Doctor,
My
for
pleasure.
joining us. This has been the Glenn Mercer Show, where everyone listening turns vegan, regains their health, and annoys their friends and relatives. Find us on YouTube at The Glenn Mercer Show and across all your major podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe.